What's up, all you CSV Cafe viewers? I got my coffee here today. Today I want to go over a little bit on the definitions and the misconceptions, and as well as the approach of agile and validation. And agile and validation are not competing methodologies. They're not. So, but they answer different questions. And this is very important for all of you who are developing and are in a GXP environment. My name is Justo. Welcome to CSV Cafe. And today we're going to talk about a little bit how actually agile and validation are not necessarily the same, but they do work with each other. So all of you who do not know, these are methodologies that you find within development life cycles and as well as within system life cycles when you are verifying or validating an environment within a GXP company or a regulated company, something that a system or a function or a process, a thing that can impact the patient safety, the product quality, and the data integrity. And these are very important to understand. These are our risks that we want to make sure we mitigate. But before we get into that topic, like I said, Agile is primarily a development delivery approach. I'll say it again. Agile is primarily a development delivery approach, while validation is an assurance, a compliance process demonstrating that a computerized system is fit for its intended use. And the evidence supporting that conclusion is adequate. What does that mean in English? Does your functionality work the way you need it to work? And the evidence to prove that it's working is reliable and is also adequate enough to prove that you have verified that intended use. The simplest way I can explain to all of you is basically three layers. And these three separate layers is your development methodology, your system lifecycle, and then your validation, which is validation and assurance. Now, when we look at development methodology, you ask yourself the question, how do we build or configure that piece, that functionality? And when we ask that question, how do we build and how do we configure it? There are examples out there like Scrum, Kanban boards, waterfall methodologies, Agile. Great. That's one layer. Then we have the system lifecycle. How do we manage it from idea to retirement? Got a few more years for that. How do we manage from idea to retirement? And that is basically a concept, then you implement, then you have an operation, and then you have a retirement. So in the system lifecycle, you have a concept. We are planning something, we're planning a functionality, and there we're going to implement this functionality. We're going to have this functionality in the operation model. And then from there, maybe that functionality is not required anymore. So we're retiring it. This is a system lifecycle. And then you have your validation and assurance. Again, three layers: development methodology, system lifecycle, and now validation assurance. How do we establish and document confidence that it is fit for intended use? How do we validate and assure that the functionality that we have implemented, that you have developed within your development layer, and you have it implemented into your environment, is now fit for its intended use? Risk assessments, requirements, testing, a traceability, acceptance, release evidence, dot, dot, dot. All of these are examples for your validation and assurance. So when you're just saying, we're doing agile validation, I always like to giggle. No, you're validating an environment and you have agile methodologies. So saying that we're doing agile validation can be misleading, and it could actually confuse certain roles, maybe those in quality, maybe even if you have a validation compliance experts that are in the team and you're going in and talking about those technical aspects such as agile, Scrum, that can be misleading. And somehow people may think that validation itself has somehow become a Scrum, which actually is not the right thing. The best thing you can actually, more accurate statement that you would say to yourself is, we're developing and delivering the system using Agile while performing validation activities throughout the lifecycle. Let's repeat that again. We're developing and delivering the system using Agile while performing validation activities throughout the lifecycle. Let's have a sip of coffee and let that sit there for a while. Now, when we look at GAMP, Good Automated Manufacturing Practices, and the International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineering, which is your ISPE guidelines, they have a GAMP guide called Agile Software Development in GXP Regulated Environments. And ISPE explicitly addresses the misconception that CSV, Computer Software Validation, requires a V model waterfall approach. It says GAMP 5 promotes a risk-based approach to validate and does not define the software development methodology lifecycle. Even more importantly, the current GAMP guidance explicitly supports incremental, iterative, and evolutionary approaches, including Agile in the GXP environment. So it's really adding to ensure your assurance. So GMP doesn't actually equal waterfall. Validation doesn't actually equal waterfall. And Agile doesn't equal validation. You can absolutely validate a system being developed through Agile, through Scrum, through Kanban. And this is a misconception that I'm trying to get to all of you to understand. So here are some issues where I'm thinking where you might be getting yourself in trouble. When someone says we're Agile, so we don't create requirements up front, and quality responds, but we need approved requirements, then development responds, well, that's waterfall. And then suddenly everybody's fighting, right? Fighting over the Jira tickets while the poor computerized system is sitting in the corner wondering what it did wrong. So Annex 11, which is your EMA regulation for computerized systems for electronic records, electronic signatures, so on and so forth, doesn't tell you that requirements have to live inside a giant URS document written 6 months before development begins. It says that user requirements should describe what's required functions, and based on documented risk assessments of those user requirements and the GAMP and the GXP impact, and remain traceable throughout the life cycle. That's what it says. That user requirements should be described and should also connect to the required functions and be based on documented risk assessments and GXP impacts, and of course remain traceable among the entire life cycle. As well, it expects appropriate testing. And that could be many things. So you need to have some appropriate testing methods. You need to have some different scenarios, formal assessments. You need to be able to define what you're testing and what your outcomes should be. Now, you could, for example, have something that helps. You got an epic, then you have a user story, then you have an acceptance criteria, then you have a risk test evidence release. When you look at the traditional approach, you have user requirement specifications, functional specifications, design specifications, installation qualification, and OQ operational qualification. A PQ, then you have your validation report. So when you look at the distinction, Agile manages the flow of development. Validation manages the confidence in its intended use. So let's put that sentence aside a little bit. Let's think about that for a minute. I'm going to repeat that just in case you didn't hear me say it. Agile manages the flow of development. Validation manages confidence in its intended use. So they work in layers. We talked about the 3 layers. So when you look at questions, Agile asks, what are we building next? While validation asks, how do we know what we built is suitable for its intended GXP use? And when I say intended use, I mean what its functions, right? When I want to turn on a car, My intended use is when I put the key inside the ignition. These days I press a button. When I press that button, the car turns on. I got an old school car, so I still put the key in the ignition, turn it, turns on. Intended use. Press the button, car turns on. But if I don't have my foot on the brake, the car won't turn on. So I need to make sure that the intended use of that, just using that example, when I press that stop start engine button and my foot is not on the brake, then the car does not start. That's the intended use. The intended use of that button is to start when you have your foot on the brake. So with that simple example, you can see that these processes can run alongside each other. And in fact, the modern regulatory thinking is increasingly friendly towards exactly this approach. And what I mean by that is that the guidances that are out there is giving us the opportunity to take the agile methodology and to take the validation concept and work together, not replace each other. It's not. They work together. So FDA's current computer software assurance guidance emphasizes establishing confidence based on risk rather than producing documentation for documentation's sake. I've been doing this for over 18 years. Back then, when we first started doing this, there was heavy binders of documents, binders thick, for no reason whatsoever, just because that's the way it was done, and no one knew any better. And as time evolved, we realized, wait a minute, we can focus on the risks. And if you're listening to this for the first time, your GXP risks are data integrity, product quality, patient safety, basically, not in that order, but you get the idea. I also like to add in their business risks. People don't talk to me about that too much, but I like to mention, hey, if this functionality goes, will your business also be impacted? Will your product not be able to go to the market? Can you cause let's say, a market disruption if this functionality goes sideways, right? So these are some questions to ask yourself, but majority of all of this is patient safety, product quality, and data integrity. So based on risk rather than producing documentation. So the FDA describes a risk-based approach where rigor and assurance activities are selected based on the software's impact. And you can go to the FDA website and you can check that out. Likewise, the good automated manufacturing practice explicitly says Agile can be implemented in a way that is aligned with GXP. And I got that in the ISPE website. So let's talk about what I would not do and what I would do. Okay, this is my approach from 17, 18 years of experience. What I would not try to do is cram the traditional validation lifecycle into every sprint. So for any developers who are out there listening to this, or anyone who are agile facilitators, scrum masters, and so on and so forth, for example, don't take sprint 14 and you say develop, then URS, then FSDS, IQ, QPQ, and then VSR. Then sprint 15 starts on Monday and everybody gets to enjoy the same paperwork again. In fact, that's mini waterfalls within the agile name tags. So of course, everyone's going to think we're still doing waterfall. Instead, I'll separate the continuous assurance activities from the release level validation decisions. Something closer to, say I have a backlog or intended use. And then with that, we create the user stories and what is our acceptance criteria for our user stories. Then from there, we have a GXP quality risk assessment based on what we're looking at within those user stories. Then IT will go in and develop and configure these items, where then developers will, and supplier testing can occur. Risk-based assurance testing also then occurs after that. Then from there, you have the capturing of the evidence, and then as well, the release readiness assessment, and then you have your validated state. Then you repeat that incrementally. The validation strategy sits around and across the agile delivery process rather than trying to become the agile delivery process itself. See, in my point of view, I'm seeing teams really making the mistake of taking the word agile and thinks everything's gonna be fast. I'm adding the word agile. That means it's gonna be fast. That's what I'm seeing. If you see anything different, please comment below. Let me know. I'm open for this discussion. I really want to make sure your team is doing this the most optimal way possible and not mixing the definitions and not mixing these approaches, these layers, not just kind of taking these three layers that we were going over earlier and mixing them all together. And there is another important distinction, which I like to go one step further. Software development and computerized system validation aren't even necessarily owned by the same organization. Take that for a minute. Digest that. Software development and computerized system validation aren't even necessarily owned by the same organization. What does that mean? Let's say you have a SaaS vendor, software as a service vendor, that may develop products using their agile approach. They have their sprint 41, 42, 43, 44, sprint. The pharmaceutical company doesn't validate that vendor, that SaaS vendor's agile process. The regulated company, let's say I'm Pharma, I am the regulated company. I need to ensure that its configured implementation of that product is fit for intended GXP use. I want to make sure that Pharma doesn't impact our patients, doesn't impact the quality of our product, and also we have good, strong integrity of our data. When you look at this distinction, it's actually supported by many different regulated bodies like EMA, MHRA, the FDA. They position, even together with the practices, the good automated manufacturing practices that are out there, help position the vendor supplied validation evidence as a support, but alone it's not sufficient. It's insufficient because validation must also consider the system configuration, the intended use, the business process, and the end user environment. Trainings, things like that, SOPs, guidelines, or working instructions. So it seems like we're repeating ourselves a little bit, don't you think? It seems as we do not know how to distinct differences between the two. It might seem like that, but I strongly believe it's just an upskilling from different departments, and everyone has their agenda and everyone has their approach or understanding on these matters. So what this does is it brings a huge point that you can leverage. If, let's say, we're working back with the software as a service vendor, supplier evidence. If you have a mature supplier, some that I have no affiliation with, you have TrekWise, you have Viva, you have Master Control, you have many different suppliers out there that bring in functionalities, that bring in processes, that bring in the solutions that you require, and you can leverage their evidence. You can leverage their automated tests. You can leverage their agile artifacts. You can leverage some of their acceptance criteria and their JIRA stories. But the regulatory organization, the regulated organization, still owns the determination. So do we have sufficient evidence to conclude this computerized system is fit for intended GXP use? That's validation assurance. So I like to draw the relationship like this. Agile delivery, idea, backlog, story, build, test, increment, release. GXP validation assurance, your intended use, your GXP impact, the risk, the requirement, the assurance activities, such as testing the verifications, evidence acceptance, and then as well as the validated state. They intersect constantly. They're basically, they might be on the same parallel road, and then eventually some cross. They have a little circle if you're in Europe, whatever it may be, but they do intersect constantly. But they're not the same process. They're not. Sorry. And if you're upset because of that, I didn't make it up. I'm just your messenger. And that distinction matters organizationally. Why? Because otherwise, teams start believing things like, hey, the story passed. It's done. That means the acceptance testing passed the story. Before, we're validated. Wrong. You're not. Not necessarily. Passing a story proves something about that story. Validation is the accumulated argument and evidence that the system, in its required usage, intended operating context, is fit for that use and remains under control. Meaning every time I press that start button with my foot on the brake, that car should turn on. If it doesn't, I have an incident. It's not the intended use. This approach, this discussion aligns with Annex 11's lifecycle approach and its emphasis on risk management throughout the computerized system lifecycle. You can find this on EMA websites, on Annex 11. Shoot, if you need some support, just reach out to me and we could be able to help you. We can come into your organization, we can train your team, we can get them prepared to understand the distinctions between both. So one other thing that I want to say that actually strengthens my point of view here in this session, this episode, for all of you who are watching. The European Commission's revised Annex 11, and they even pushed harder towards lifecycle management and comprehensive application of quality risk management, rather than prescribing a particular software development methodology. And you can check that out last year in 2025, around the April-ish timeframe. These updates were happening, and they continue to be happening. So stop calling it agile validation, please. It's not. It confuses and misleads what's everyone's understanding and what is validation process and what is the agile methodology. So what did we go over today? Development, lifecycle, validation. Agile answers how we're going to develop and deliver this thing. The system lifecycle answers how we're going to manage this thing from a concept until retirement. And validation answers how do we demonstrate that this thing function is fit for intended GXP use. If you're with me this far, thank you very much for watching. I'm Justo. This is CSV Cafe, and today we're learning a little bit of the distinctions between agile and validation. And if you still have questions and you still don't know which way to go, please, 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 please contact me, contact my team. We can be able to help you. Till next time, I'm Justo. This is CSV Cafe. I wish you all a wonderful validation
If you don't follow the rules, then the regulators will come and make you look like a fool. Warning letters and 483s and fun because they cause stress and may get you hung.